Thank you. Our third question is on Richard M. Frank on Avicenna and Al-Ghazālī, and in his creation and the cosmic system, Richard M. Frank interpreted Al-Ghazālī through the teachings of Avicenna and concluded that from a theological standpoint, most of the theses which he rejected are relatively tame and inconsequential compared to some of those in which he follows the philosopher. Does this kind of reading of Al-Ghazālī do epistemological justice to his approach? Does it lead to a lack of interest in his traditional Islamic works compared to the philosophical ones, despite their great significance for Muslim communities, past and present?
For me, it's a difficult question to answer because I don't work much on Kalam. What I would like to say about this famous book about creation and the cosmic system, it's also, I think, that it changed a bit our way we were reading Ibn Sina. Mm-hmm. Because I think many people were reading Ibn Sina, at least among the philosophers, in function simply of the Shifa. And they were sometimes a bit too much influenced by how the Shifa was understood through the Latin translation, even if they were using the Arabic. One could see that in some of the work of Abuna, a great friend of Dick Frank, Father Anawati. So I think that is, I was impressed by the fact of the wide range of the text of Ibn Sina Dick Frank had read. And it's not always easy, even at that time, because sometimes the editions were not very good or they were difficult to get at. So I think that has also changed our approach to Ibn Sina. And that approach also needs to change, so to speak, because you have still some people who think that Avicenna is Ibn Sina. And I am sorry, there may be some kind of brothers, but they are not identical brothers. Not simply because of shift in translation, because maybe the translator did not. Though usually those translations are quite remarkable. I have seen modern translation using computer and all sorts of things that are not at the level of some of these translations. But there was also the way the texts were understood, because once you get a text in translation, words can have other connotation. And therefore, the person using the translation may be sometimes simply misled by the connotation that are different. And also the more, and I didn't do that much work in that, but the more I am looking at the way some of the Latin medieval were reading the translation, I have no doubt that they were using them sometimes so that they would say what they wanted to say. I mean, I did recently some work on very funny passage in Roger Bacon. I have no doubt that Bacon was very free in his understanding of the text he had in front of him, though he speaks of Ibn Sina with such reverence. I mean, when you see you think that Avicenna is the great master for ethics. Well, I am sorry, Ibn Sina wrote very little about ethics. And when
we're not even sure. Yes.
And then when you see what he does with the ethical passage in the metaphysics, and you wonder, is it because he doesn't know much about Islam? He doesn't realize that Ibn Sina is trying to justify basic principles of Islamic life, like the 4 of the pillars of Islam are there, the way the worship is done and so on, which for somebody who knows something about Islamic studies in the Arabic world, I mean, it looks, what? He doesn't see. He has a very strange way. And at some stage, he used what Ibn Sina says about Muhammad and about the Caliph, and applies that in such a way that it becomes a big praise for the Pope. And transposing what was said of the Caliph and of Muhammad to the Pope, I think is pushing things very far. It's absolutely hilarious when you, what? And it's a Franciscan who says that. So I think that's still something that people who do philosophy, and it's quite now the field of looking much more carefully to the Arabic sources of the medieval Latin philosopher, and it's doing lots of progress. But there are still some people who are not very careful to distinguish what you can say in function of the translation and in function of how those people wanted to read the text. I think it's always a bit, if you are trained in philosophy in more recent time than the medieval ages, you were always trained to be an exeget, what they were really seeing. But medievals don't read texts for that purpose. They read them to find what they think is the truth. So they have tendency to, if they think the text doesn't say really what they think is the truth, they may think, well, there is a problem with my manuscript translation. And of course, they work on manuscript, which means you can have mistakes introduced by scribes and things, odd things. There are cases like that that are famous. And also how they want to read the text. And don't forget, medieval Latin world, and it's a bit like that also, I think, in the Islamic world, you are not supposed to be original, to make a new contribution. You always need to invoke authorities. On the Latin side, they say you have to be a dwarf on the shoulders of giants. Right. And therefore, they want some authority. I think Roger Bacon sometimes used Ibn Sina. He needs an authority, though he claims that authorities are bad things in some texts. A little detail. And then they make the text say what they want. In some cases, not always. So I think that's something that in some sense, those people probably don't read Dick Frank, but those who have read Dick Frank and work on both the Arabic and the Latin have begun to realize much more. I don't know if it is your view too.
I think so. So, you know, the question again is about Dick Frank and our understanding of both Avicenna and Ghazālī, and this claim that what Ghazālī rejects is actually pretty tame compared to what he he accepts and has this, I'm just wanting to make sure I get the question, and has this distracted us from the more the straight kalam works and say focus on things like the Tahafut or something like this. So as I said, I've had sort of two encounters with Dick, and my more recent one was very different than my earlier one. But I was asked, was it from the one to the many, or what the collection that was done by Louvain and
that
From
was
the many to the one.
many to the one. That's it,
James
right?
Montgomery.
Yeah, exactly.
Montgomery.
Exactly. So I was asked to write an article or a paper for this collection in honor of Dick Frank. And so again, I felt like I couldn't do it without, if I only looked at, the Tahafut, I was, not doing justice to the man. So I was forced to actually read some kalam text. So I will admit, most of that article, if you look at it, is on looking at causality and the so-called critique of causality, in that work in 18, 17, what is it? Discussion
20.
No, it's
You mean the metaphysics?
no, of the 17.
Oh, the 17.
Yeah,
The
17.
On
17,
causality.
18.
That's the 17.
7.
I was in the right neighborhood. Okay. And so two things I just remember when I was writing that one. One, I went back to the Huffet and I was reading this, but now again with this sort of Dick Frank thesis that read it carefully. And then I just noticed things like, he says there's 4 theories, but then he only explains 3. And you're like, wait a second. So what, somebody has gone missing or has been snuck in there? And then I realized that it's like, oh, I mean, it looks like there's something close to an occasionalism. He's introducing this notion of maybe passive powers and active powers, and passive powers need something that actually activate them, but the thing itself really then has the power to act. And so as I looked at it, I'm like, oh, this is just not straight occasionalism. I mean, maybe you can get, and I can see why reading it, you can say, oh, this is just occasionalism, but it was a very, very subtle form of occasionalism. And so I was very proud of that. And then I just remembered, if I don't do any kalam here, Dick Frank is going to say, what the hell happened? And so I also then, that was the first time I actually read through parts of the Iqtisad, the discussion on Qudra, which is, and in fact, in the anthology that David Reisman and I did, everyone had said, well, you need to do a translation of discussion 17. It's like, nah, I don't want to do that one. I'm going to do this one on Qudra. That's a much more interesting, philosophically rich, and they should be introduced to Kalam. And then also because of things that I had read, and Dick Frank, he says, the meaning of the names of God, that's also a very rich text. And so if you look at my article, I'm not saying you should, but those 2 texts, and why did I choose those 2 texts? Because Dick Frank, I'm like, if I'm gonna do him justice, I've got to look at those texts. And so do I think that, this thing, the claim that it's, has it made us not look at it? Well, if you're worried about Dick Frank saying, why didn't you do it? Believe me, no, it isn't. I was very much encouraged to look at the Kalam texts. And I then have the same thing as I went back more recently and was looking at the revivification, the Halul Madin, and this discussion on love, which Dick Frank would never have written a paper on love. Let me just say this, but as I read that text, Dick Frank was there the entire time as I was trying to understand it, and it helped me understand it. So no, I don't think that him saying that, it's relatively tame, I think it makes you read it at a much richer sort of level. You have to go back to these Kalam texts if you really want to see what's going on. So short, but I think we agree on this. So,
Toby?
Thanks. I'm not sure how to approach this question. I interpret this third question in a sense as asking whether Richard Frank underestimated Ghazali's Asherism. And it's, my simple answer to that is, in a way, yes. And the way I come to that is, I think, a thing I said before, which is that in Ghazali's more Sufi texts, I find a lot of Asherism. Maybe it's a sort of sublimated Asherism, but it's right there. And John just referred to the Maqsad al-Asna. I mean, that commentary on the divine names converts into a book on ethics. How? Because virtue is participation in God's names and attributes. So you have to take God's names and attributes very seriously if that's how you're going to frame virtue. And that is a complex Ash'ari God of attributes. It's very different, of course, from Ash'ari ethics in the sense of divine command theory, yes. But there's still this Ash'ari element in it, the focus on the very serious evaluation of God's names and attributes. So yes, I would look for Ash'ari elements in what Richard Frank calls Al-Ghazālī's higher theology as well.
Thank you.
I here should probably say what Toby expresses cautiously, I would probably try to make a little bit clearer. Although creation and the cosmic system, of course, had a great impact on my career and on my life, at the end of the day, I think it shoots beyond the target. There were a couple of conceptual possibilities that Richard and Frank didn't consider. So he realized that in many of his works, Al-Ghazālī is no longer an occasionalist, but subscribes to the secondary causality of Avicenna. But what he didn't fully consider is that he could also introduce very subtle changes to it that actually turn it then into an Asharite version of secondary causality, which has actually happened in the post-Ghazali tradition. I mean, there are lots of people who work with secondary causality. Fakhruddin Arazi is a good example, even in works in this case that are definitely Asharite, and so meaning in this case, and the impression. And this is the last sentence that was in the from Creation of the Cosmic System that Aseel actually read out, namely in this case that the things that he condemns are tame in comparison to those that he takes. I don't think that's true. What he condemns is the eternity of the world, which is really which is a conception about God. Here in this case, I mean, what kind of God are we talking about? And Richard and Frank was under the impression when he wrote Creation and the Cosmic System that Al-Ghazālī would express the same kind of God, meaning a self-necessitated God, that he would actually subscribe to that. Now, this question was actually at the bottom. This actually is a question that I took up when I came to Yale. Before that, I had written a different story. My dissertation was on apostasy. And now I was actually looking at that. And now I was looking at the 17th discussion that Richard and Frank didn't touch. He did not look into that. And more or less out of that came then the book Al-Ghazālī's philosophical theology, where I basically say, yeah, you can get the impression there are passages that are very difficult to understand in Al-Ghazālī, but overall he puts forward a second or a vision of, particularly in the Ihya, an ontology that works with secondary causality, but at the end of the day maintains that the world is created at one point in time. And the kind of reconciliation is what Toby has already referred to, happens in the veil section of Mishkat al-Anwar, where he has a very, very neat solution. He basically takes all the cosmology and ontology of Avicenna and says, sure, all this is valid, but my God created this system at one point in time. And that's very neat, I would say, that what Al-Ghazālī does. Meaning in this case that I think that the impression that, or also what he expresses quite vividly, in Creation and the Cosmic System that Al-Ghazālī subscribed to substantial and problematic premises of Avicenna as an Ash'ari, didn't happen. No, he did not do that.
Yeah, I think I'm the less qualified person to answer the question. But as you asked also about like whether sort of the portrayal as Ghazali as primarily an Avicennan sort of is matches with where the reception he has like among the Muslim community and whether it does justice. Maybe I just jump on this part of the question. Right, because I'm recently more working on the Islamic West, where we have like this very controversial reception of Al-Ghazali, and we have like the book burnings under the reign of the Almoravids. And we still don't have a clear idea why this happened, I think. What was the motivation to burn the Ihya? I don't think it was because he was perceived as a very Avicennaized thinker. There's also the other picture of Al-Ghazali that you find among Muslim communities. And then sort of you have then again, the image is switching again a little later in the same region with the rise of the Almohads, where suddenly Al-Ghazali is sort of a person of respect, where even the founder of the movement claims to have studied with this person and comes up with a theology that might include some ideas of Aristotelian or of Avicennan thinking, like the logical modality, etc., but then remains, it's not a philosophical text. So again, has many elements of more Juwaynian Ash'arism, then has its own elements, but again, it's not like the Avicennan Ghazali that is then popularized in the Islamic West. So I just mentioned this to show, there are also these other perceptions of Al-Ghazali and these, different perspectives. So it's definitely not the whole Ghazali that is like that we find there.